Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Awkward Silences. Today, we are here with Sheryl Cababa, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Substantial and also the author of Closing the Loop Systems Thinking for Designers. Really excited to have you here and dig into this really big, meaty topic of systems thinking. Thanks for joining us today.
Yes, absolutely. Really happy to be here.
Got Jay here too.
Yeah, this feels like a topic or a category that people like to talk about. Like I hear everyone mention systems thinking, but I'm always curious how well people actually understand it or apply it in their work. So I'm excited to dig in.
Yeah. Yeah, systems thinking. It's something I enjoy systems thinking. I think about like ecosystems, ecosystems, about how things exist in a context and not in a vacuum. But I don't know. I'm sure you're gonna enlighten us a lot on what systems thinking is and how it applies to designers and maybe also what it isn't. Sometimes it's easy or to understand things by what they aren't. So let's dig into it.
Yeah, great.
Well, first of all, I guess what made you write this book? Why do you enjoy thinking about systems thinking?
Yeah, so I actually hadn't really integrated systems thinking into my work until about 6 or 7 years ago. And one thing that I kind of found as a designer is that I was starting to feel a little bit like the methods that we use are had some shortcomings in terms of like the things that we were being tasked to think about, especially because if you work, for example, in user experience design or digital design, a lot of the things we're designing are just kind of like at enormous scale, and in a way and has like a user base that we we don't really, it doesn't seem like our tools for designing things kind of like respond to that. And the methods that I'm thinking about at core are just what we understand as design thinking or user centered design. Oftentimes, we're kind of designing with like a single user in mind and thinking about the benefits of use of a product like in the moment and thinking about how maybe they walk through an experience for the most part. And then that sort of leaves out these other questions we might have, like who our other stakeholders are, what happens sort of like contextually beyond that experience, and also like who are the variety of potential end users as well as like end beneficiaries, people who might be affected by our products but maybe aren't even users of the products that we're working on. All of these felt like gaps in thinking, and so I started like kind of delving into systems thinking methodology to kind of better understand like, are there ways that I could integrate this in my practice? And the reason that I decided to write a book about it is because I'm a designer who has already has like a job. I'm a design strategist and researcher, right? But my background is in product design, and I already have a job as a designer, right? I already have like processes, methods. I fit in a certain point in the design and development process, especially for things like software. And I occupy a certain place within the organization. And so looking at systems thinking methods, it felt like these ideas are great. Um, how exactly do I integrate this into my practice? Like, my goal is not to suddenly become a systems thinking methodology practitioner and leave my job as a designer behind. I need to figure out a way to kind of like integrate it into my practice in a way that is like actually actionable and accessible. And so I felt like there was a little bit of a gap in the literature around this intersection of kind of like design and design thinking and systems thinking. And I couldn't find it like resources myself on like how these things might intersect. And so yeah, I thought making a book, the writing a book that feels kind of accessible and actionable and to designers, I think is something that felt like worth doing.
Nice, that's awesome. Do you have any like examples you can recall of like when you were a designer, like before and after, kind of exploring systems thinking of like I used to approach something this way, and then I kind of shifted my approach, like just something maybe tangible for folks to kind of help hook onto it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of thinking like I've worked on everything from like I don't know, early early activity monitors. I worked at Philips Design for a while and worked on an activity monitor before the Fitbit came out. I remember the day the Fitbit came out, and I was like, our team was kind of like, "Whoa, like, oh, this is our competition." And that product that I was working on had this kind of like complex system of like real life coaches and things like that. And but it sort of felt like the area in which I was tasked to think was really about the interface, like just like the interface of like when you plug this thing into your machine and you kind of like look at your data. That was what I was kind of like working on. And not to say that that's not complex, but there was this entire system of the business model of this particular device, and also yeah, how it was sold, how it was marketed, who they expected the audience to be. And I don't think I was really like privy to kind of like the decisions that like whatever factored into those decisions. And so I was working on this narrow space, but questions would keep coming up for me like, okay, so I'm designing this interaction between like a coach and like this user, but I don't even really know like what the parameters are around like who this coach is and how they're kind of connected to this product. And you can kind of like learn these things piecemeal, but it felt like there was some sort of like missing analysis of like what is feeding into where this product sits and what's the context in its almost in its entirety in which it sits. And so it felt like a fairly like you know, and I think this is like my experience as a product designer in general. It felt a little bit like dissatisfying in that I was like tasked with this like narrow slice where my lane was kind of like working in this doing this screeny thing, and the screeny thing had so much like impact beyond like what I was doing as well as like inputs into what I was doing that I wasn't like fully aware of. Um so I think that's one of the reasons I became a design strategist is because like I was kind of like a disgruntled product designer. And so it felt like getting into like going upstream a little bit in terms of decisions um, was a sort of like more satisfying move for me. Um, and then I think ostensibly when uh, when I really started like using more systems thinking analysis was when I was working on things like I don't know, healthcare, kind of like healthcare products and services. You know, for example, I worked on a robotic surgery project where they were kind of like thinking about the ecosystem. And I think like the thinking about those ecosystems are like the entry point to systems thinking methodology. So yeah, I mean, I think there's many instances in which designers like are sort of put in the same position, especially if you're in a big organization or you're working on a big like enterprise product or something. You might be tasked with like this like narrow slice, but with very little understanding of what surrounds it.
Yeah, interesting. As you were talking about this, I started to think a lot about sort of ethnography, right? A research method which uh, takes, you talk about the interaction of the wearable device, right? And it's like your job is to research the user and the device and their interaction between it. But of course, the device and the person live in an environment with context, with things happening around them, to say nothing of the business in which the device is being developed. This has me thinking about ethnography as a method to get at some of this other stuff. Is that a method that can maybe bridge some of this gap between traditional UX methods and systems thinking, or where does that sit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like in my job as like a design researcher, I I do a lot of I guess I wouldn't call it like exactly ethnography, but ethnography kind of inspired work, whereas it's like you're trying to understand the context in which the experience of use is going to sit. So you know, quite different from UX research, where yeah, you're like looking directly at the intersection between like the device and, the human using it. Um, and it's funny because like I kind of think like that is a really good that intersects really well with systems thinking, is like framing your mindset around like how best to understand context and not just kind of like that direct benefit of use. Yeah, understanding people's experiences before they even like have any interaction with like a specific product or service is essential in essentially good design thinking. I think where the gap is for a lot of like how this is typically implemented in design research is that I would feel that there was this missing sort of element of like getting at really broadly who your users are and those who might be affected by like your eventual design decisions. So, for example, I work a lot in education, and um, the work that we do at Substantial is oriented around equity centered design. And so we're specifically thinking about sort of the populations who have been marginalized within like the design decision making process, traditionally and typically. So, for example, we kind of think about how Black and Latino students in the US like experience certain like education technology products, or like their we try to understand like their experiences within the system and engage them in co-design. And I think like that's an extension of systems thinking, is kind of like engaging with this idea of more broadly like who the people who might be affected by the things you're designing might be, like the categories they fall in, and like how you can kind of better design with outcomes in mind, like with sort of outcomes that are oriented around equity. And I think yeah, like there's a lot that's, I think the really nice intersection of systems thinking and design thinking is that designers are orienting towards that humanistic approach. I think an issue with systems thinking methodology, like as it stood like over the years, is like that it feels very abstract, that it feels very like non-human, that it kind of reduces like people to forces that interact with each other. Um, and I think a designer superpower is that we do take this approach that is really human centered, that are oriented around humans, that is like intended to be empathy driven. And you can use that as a starting point. I think is just like thinking more broadly about who your stakeholders are, kind of in terms of the entirety of the system, rather than just like focusing on a really narrow slice of who the stakeholders are, which is like maybe like your end user and maybe like the decision makers within your organization. um so yeah, I do think like sort of that approach, that ethnographic research inspired approach, is like really really useful like within the sort of systems thinking process specifically for designers. And I wrote about it in the book. I think there was a moment where I'm like, am I just writing about design research here? Like, should I be doing this? And I was almost like, oh yeah, the audience here should have familiarity with some of what I'm writing out about foundation. Like you have to do foundational research. You have to do foundational research. You have to do generative research. But I think a lot of people actually don't necessarily do that to the extent that we should be, even when it comes to just design thinking. So I made sure to include it because I do think there is this extension for me in terms of like taking that approach of like really understanding context foundationally before like going into any sort of like problem solving.
Yeah. Is there an aspect of this that is like contextual at all? Like, so if I'm a designer or researcher and we're doing like maybe a narrow thing, like we got some very targeted feedback that this menu's a little confusing and we're just gonna like redesign it minorly to clear that up. Like, can maybe a situation like that or something in that spirit maybe is like you don't need to think about the system as much. Like you can kind of zoom in and it's maybe okay. Whereas we're trying to stand up a new product offering or a new suite of functionality, and we really need to think about like how does this fit into our business model? How does this fit into the user experience with the suite of products? Like, so are there areas like as you're doing research or design that you like dial this up and down depending on the type of work you're doing, or how would you encourage people to think about that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I do think like there is the kind of problem solving that is just there's it's problem solving to like figure out like how something can just like work better, and you know exactly like what you're trying to achieve there. Um and yeah, maybe that doesn't require you creating like a whole, you know, mapping exercise of like causal loop diagrams and things like that. Um and yeah, that's totally fine. I mean, the I think there is kind of like a difference between I talk a little bit about hard systems methodology and soft systems methodology. And the way I like to describe that is that, you know, Karl Popper, the philosopher, he had this like sort of metaphor for types of problems. And he describes some things as cloud problems and some things as clock problems. And I think a lot of like engineering, kind of building things, kind of problems fall into the clock problems category. Like you're trying to make a clock and you're trying to figure out how to make it work and for it to kind of like tell time with precision. It's very directive, you know exactly like what you're trying to do. And then there are cloud problems. So these are more ambiguous. There's a sense of multi-finality, which is like a term in system thinking that describes like there are many, many different ways to solve a problem. And it could go in many different directions. And also, you might not have like even a great deal of clarity on what the problem itself is. I think a good intersection or a good description of like what you might think of as cloud problems is like wicked problems. So, like Horst Ritter in the 1970s coined that to describe problems that are so complex that there's not any singular way of solving them. Um, and so, yeah, I think like the cloud problem space is really good for systems thinking. I think the cloud problem space, not so much. Like that's very like directional already when you kind of like know exactly what you're going to be doing. I think the issue lies in that we oftentimes assign actual like cloud problems or cloud problem solving to the clock space, and so that's where we kind of like run into trouble. Like if you're working on like a social media platform or something like that, um you know, you're thinking about it as clock problems, but because there's like this human social collective kind of behavioral aspect to it, it then becomes a cloud problem. And we need to like be able to acknowledge that through sort of like a shift in our tools and analysis.
Yeah, to build off that, have you found ways for designers or researchers to like identify what they might be working on? Like, how do you know which one's which? I'd imagine if you're a builder and like you're in a design role, to your point, you kind of see a lot of things probably as clock problems because of the nature of your work. And so, are there good like rules of thumb or things you've done in your career to help you identify like what you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because like I don't think I have like a formula or anything like that. But the way I kind of describe like system, just like the concepts of systems thinking is there's like three different components. So it's like thinking about things, how things are interconnected, thinking about causality, and thinking about wholeness. So if you're working on something that seems like super interconnected with other things and you don't have like a lot of, I guess, like visibility into what those other things are, you should you probably should work to make those interconnections visible, like to yourself as a practitioner, to your organization, because I think that'll be required in order to be able to um, be successful in terms of like the product or service that you're designing. I think there's also causality. So oftentimes we just kind of think about like, okay, we're designing or creating this thing, and then this is how somebody's going to experience it. And that's kind of like all we're interested in. But I think one of the things that I focused more readily on over the past few years is just how do you connect that to like broader outcomes, like either like societal outcomes or, outcomes that happen like beyond just like the direct benefit of use. And then lastly, there's wholeness. So I think just kind of thinking about that context in which your product or service sits, like, is there, I don't know, are there things that in that regard you need to make visible as well? Like, for example, just working often with like ed tech developers, um, I think they're oftentimes thinking about like a specific use case. Like a student will use this in the context of like math class or something like that. And they're not really like, they don't, they're not necessarily like aware of things like how are those students assessed in math? Like what kinds of diversity of environments is this product even going to be used in? What kind of like connectivity do different like school systems have? Who are the buyers like in this particular like school district? What kinds of schools are you kind of like thinking about integrating this within? What kind of learning management system is this particular school district using? And what's the demographics of students who are kind of like in these environments? What kinds of resources do they have? And like, I think, I mean, they're designing a clock, but like, I think just having visibility or alignment on what is like the cloud that surrounds that clock, I guess, would be beneficial in that then you can kind of make decisions about your product that could result. I mean, honestly, like it could result in new ideas. You could end up doing like, it can be a driver of innovation. It can also be like a problem solver before you go ahead and kind of like release this product out into the world. So I think there's like, I don't know, kind of like different ways that you can articulate systems within your work, as well as like use your understanding of the system to acknowledge where like additional problem solving needs to happen.
Cheryl, I imagine a potential risk or concern with systems thinking as contrasted with design thinking or evaluative methods, clock making methods, is this sounds like big and chaos and we're like diverging, right? I'm imagining chalkboards with webs and lots of interconnecting drawings and just chaos, right? Because everything's connected and it's whole and it's causal, and right. What are the tools or methods or ways in which can sort of expand, right, but then ultimately converge and get to decisions, right, get to things moving forward?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think that that aligns with a lot of the fears that I hear about trying to do like integrate systems thinking into your project work. Is like my work is already so directional. Like I am sitting in this kind of lane and I don't I don't even know if I have like the time or resources, right, to be able to like engage in this. It doesn't have to be big. Like one of the objectives I had in like writing the book is like I want there to be like some methods in here that a design practitioner can just like read and then like take into like tomorrow's workshop, because I don't think it has to be like a super involved. You don't have to spend like 3 months creating like a giant causal loop diagram that gets shopped around to like a whole bunch of stakeholders and the rest of your organization or anything like that. I actually don't even think that's an effective way of communicating. Like I've created those in the past. Nobody, I'm going to say right now, like nobody reads them. Like nobody looks at them unless you've created some sort of executive summary of like what you've done, and they're great forms of analysis, like, and but they're not good for like funneling into decision making necessarily. I think where those kinds of methods are worthwhile. Let's say like you want to like understand causal loops like within the system in which your problem space lies. Um, the space in which you're doing this work is with a group of multidisciplinary stakeholders. Like you as a designer are not just like going off and doing this thing and then presenting it back to others. Like you're creating this. It's an alignment exercise ultimately. It's a communication tool. So like you might be thinking about okay, like an example I had was like how how do we understand how multilingual learners in middle school experience math. um I'm not just like going off as a designer and doing some secondary research or even just like interviews with students or what have you. Like I'm actually engaging with like different stakeholders within the system, whether it's like school or district administrators, academic experts like in the space, like researchers who have a good understanding of the system and the space. And then, yeah, also engaging like lived experts, like students and teachers who are, actually like maybe are most affected by the decision making within that space, but usually have like the least decision making power. And this kind of like mix of stakeholders, including like the organizational stakeholders that I'm working with, um, are a really good group to in order to determine like how to create a representation of the system, whether you're creating a causal loop diagram. I think another sort of framework that I use really often in my own work is the iceberg diagram. So kind of understanding what's on the surface, what are the things that we're seeing in terms of this particular problem space, and then what beneath that are the patterns of behavior, what is the infrastructure kind of below that, and then finally like what are the mental models. So like really understanding root cause. And I think developing that understanding, you've actually then created a space in which you can use the entirety of that for ideation. Like you can use the entirety of that to kind of think about where interventions can happen. And it doesn't just have to be at the surface level. So you might be thinking about like, I don't know, uh, tutoring supplements for the students that I was referring to earlier. But actually, there's an opportunity for professional development for teachers, right? And like these things emerge as you kind of get at root cause and you better understand like these interconnections within the system. um so I think that's like it's a good way to kind of like get start like just start doing it in workshops, right? Like I think workshops are like it frees you from thinking about this as like some sort of independent project that you're running.
Yeah. So instead of just the right back to the wearable and the person, we have some sort of diagram of the context, the environment, the ecosystem in which these things exist. And then when we want to iterate on that product, on that experience, we kind of know what the range of options are. And depending on the nature of the problem or the opportunity, where in this diagram we might want to plug into, that might be most effective. You mentioned the iceberg. There's some other kind of key sort of diagrams or exercises that are accessible to folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like understanding the status quo, like what's happening today that you might want to intervene in. The iceberg diagram is really good. I think also the Ishikawa or fishbone diagram is really good. And these are not, I think like probably formal like systems thinking methodologists would just like poo poo these. Like they'd be like, those are not like really. And I think for me, I'm just like, I think systems thinking is a mindset. Like these get at kind of like those other contextual areas that we've been talking about and like use the tool that gets you to where you need to go. Like the tool is not the thing in and of itself. I mean, I think that's oftentimes the mistake that designers make about like systems thinking is they think I need to do a causal loop diagram and then like we'll figure out where the interventions go and then we might even like model how those causal loops change. And I'm like, the map is not the thing. Like you start obsessing about that map, I don't even know like you can actually like as a designer like use your your best skills to like make change then. So I think about it as a way of like building alignment. And then it's like, okay, here are the potential points of intervention. And I talk a little bit about like, well, then how do you envision what you're changing? Um, and like, I work a lot with philanthropies and like, there's a lot in sort of like the global development space that is oriented around creating a theory of change. And I included like some theory of change frameworks in the book because like these have worked really well for just like identifying like how you can actually make something happen. Like, what are the inputs, activities, and outputs that you need to do in order. And then it always connects to like, what are the outcomes you're looking to achieve? And then what is the impact you're trying to achieve on a broader scale. So if you're working on malaria vaccines, then there are certain things you have to do. Those are the inputs, activities, and outputs. And then the outcomes are the things that you might measure, like how many people in a certain population actually get the vaccine. And then the impact is like sort of that, wild, broad dream that we have, which is like the eradication of malaria or like, the reduction of like cases of malaria. So I think it's like having that always like in the back of your mind is like, what are the outcomes and impact that we're actually trying to achieve, help you kind of like be more, I don't know, structured about like how do you actually try to achieve that and make sure like that people along the way are incentivized in the right ways and what have you.
Yeah, when you were describing some of these methods and diagramming and stuff, I had the thought in my head that was very similar to what you just described. Of they seem like they'd be easy to get pulled towards like a completionist or perfectionist streak of I want to make this as good as possible. And to your point, you spend a lot of cycles on it and a lot of time, and it isn't actually as effective, or you're not getting the best return off of it. Um, how do you know if you're doing this in a workshop and and you're making some of these fishbone diagrams or icebergs or whatever else? Like, how do you know when you've hit a spot that is good enough? Like, this is yes, it's simple and it's a little naive, but there's value here. Like, versus we just did something really quick in a half hour and it's so raw that it's actually not that useful. Like, how do you know when you've maybe hit that 80-20 point, or you've gotten something valuable?
I do think there's a step of like validating it with other people like within the system. So whether it's your decision makers or, as I mentioned before, like subject matter experts like in the field, um, is like making sure like it feels like it captures like the, entirety of the system. And yeah, I don't think it's ever going to be, I mean, you think about the alternatives to decision making, right? Like a lot of times, like decisions are made by some executive based on some assumption they have. And I think like when you're gathering like a cross-disciplinary group of people and they're kind of like their goal is to analyze the system, then you're likely to get further along than just like how those decisions might have been made, like, you know, typically. So I I think it's like maybe kind of like framing it in that way as like these are people who might not have been involved in decision making before. And so having their lens on it automatically broadens kind of like what you think about the problem space, like the conclusions you might draw. And the fact that you've done research to kind of like lead up to this spot too, and like your other stakeholders have also done research, um, means that whatever you're doing should also be evidence based. So I think um I think it's like when you're kind of like reaching that sort of alignment, that is probably the place where it's good enough. And people don't always agree on like where the system begins and ends, but you just kind of have to make decisions. Even if you don't know where the system ends, you might be able to find some spots to intervene within anyway. Yeah, oftentimes on my education projects, we involve like academic researchers, for example, that let's say like we're working on something that is oriented around assessments and how we can like change incrementally change assessments. Like we'll always pull in um experts who kind of want to blow up the system. Like who are like yeah, like assessments don't work the way they are. You can't make incremental change. Like you basically have to start over again. and that starting over is going to take 30 years. And I think like that's a really useful viewpoint, because I think it helps you draw the lines of where the system is. Sometimes those folks are like a little bit uh they're not the happiest with like the goals. Like as long as you're explicit about the goals, it's like, like the goal of like this eventual project or collaboration is not that this we're going to blow up the system, but that their perspective is really valuable in understanding like, well, if you could choose some points of intervention, like where are those points of intervention? Oftentimes like it's been really good to like collaborate with people who have like that sort of like distinct perspective. um and I can't like stress this enough, because I do think like too often, and I've been on many design teams, right? Like as a product designer, like it feels like we're just like making decisions in isolation. Like we're just like our designers, the engineers we're working with, we're not actually like involving the outside world enough, except just to like validate and do some like UXR kind of like testing or something. So this is like probably the biggest like mindset shift, is like broadening who your stakeholders are and like really pulling them into what you're working on, especially because like so much of what we're working on is so complex.
Yeah. Love to talk a little bit more about the future state, because we kind of started talking with, you've got the design thinking and the systems thinking, and they're not opposites, right? From my understanding, Venn diagrams, if you will.
Right.
There's some overlap. They're different, but not opposites. Both have strengths and weaknesses. We've got clouds, we've got clocks. Then we talked about, kind of using systems thinking to understand the status quo, to understand the world we live in, which presumably has like some problems. Otherwise, we don't need to design anything. So now we have a good map of the status quo, whether it's causal loops or an iceberg or fishtail, something more simple. How do we move to the future with all this information? You talked a little bit about a theory of change. How do we get everyone on board and use these tools to make change happen?
Yeah, so one of my favorite just like really simple tools of like trying to so there's okay, I'll back up for a second. There is creating the theory of change, which I think is like thinking about what are all the points of intervention, what are the kind of changes that you're going to make that'll have an impact. We oftentimes think of those as solutions. Like I encourage people to like step away from like the terminology of solutions, because Peter Senge, who wrote the Fifth Discipline, wrote yesterday's solutions are today's problems. So, kind of like reinforcing that mindset of like causality and yeah, circular, right? And I think like keeping that in mind, you also need to think about like what are the consequences of what we're going to do that we might not be intending, as well as like, like what could go wrong. And one of the simplest ways to kind of like work out those degrees is by doing a futures wheel. So kind of like thinking about the change that you want to make, or what is the intervention, and then just kind of like playing out in degrees. What are like the second order effects? What are the third order effects? Like what could go wrong? And then you can either like figure out how to create additional interventions to anticipate to kind of like solve for that, or you can just use it to kind of anticipate that things like could go wrong in this category, or we might have to address this down the road. And those could be just like oriented around like how are people incentivized like throughout the system, like are there things that could potentially go wrong like along the way. And it's a really nice exercise in like just kind of like thinking beyond the immediate change you want to see. I've actually done futures wheel exercises with like some of my clients, like just oriented around things like, okay, what's going to happen if you became like an all remote organization? Like, what, like there are good things that'll happen, there are bad things that'll happen. Like, just even like a really simple directional example like that, you can play out many different scenarios. And yeah, actually, like, the iceberg diagram is also like a good analysis for things like that, like how your organization is making decisions. You could be like, okay, right now we're kind of like hybrid, and these are like the things we're seeing, the potential issues with that, and these are kind of like the mental models below that. um so yeah, once you kind of like imagine what's going to happen, you can then kind of like think about how to potentially like further like create, ideate on like how you can offset that, or how you can further enhance certain things that might have positive effects. um and I also write about a little bit about like speculative design in the book, because I do think like there's an opportunity to kind of like, especially kind of like imagine the future in a way that sort of like falls a little bit outside of kind of like a techno optimistic lens. And I think this is born of like me working like like directly with a lot of like technology companies. Oftentimes it's really hard to see like the side effects when you're working on, for example, emerging technology. You only see the benefits when you're within an organization. And so how can you kind of use um, speculative design to kind of think about like the potential downsides, or like the environments in which your technology will sit in a few years' time. I think that is like, I've never seen these two things like combine, like, in any sort of like formal literature, whereas like systems thinking and speculative design. But I think it's a really good expression of systems
Mhm.
thinking in a way, because it really considers the context of the future.
AI feels like a very ripe
Mhm.
area to do some speculative design, systems thinking.
A lot to unpack there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
A question that comes to mind is, something you hear is kind of a best practice within research is, if you're the product designer who came up with a prototype, ideally you wouldn't be the one doing the usability testing on it because you're going to have some biases and you might kind of unknowingly lead people because you like the idea, you came up with it. Is some of that true here? Like if you're doing this like second and third order effect ideation and like how this might play out over the future, do you need to include people who are a little bit more removed from like the immediacy of the work to get like real perspectives of like, a bad actor could do this with it, or this might happen, or can the people who are working on it in this type of exercise actually do a pretty good job of like shifting their perspective and trying to think about some of the unintended consequences a little further out?
Yeah, I'm just like a big advocate of outside perspective. And maybe that stems from me being a consultant and like going into like organizations and kind of like grokking their organizational culture. And I'm like, okay, I know where I can kind of be like, the devil's advocate here, because like there is kind of like, yeah, culture results in sort of a shared way of thinking sometimes. And so uh I think it's always good to kind of like involve people who are outside of your team in these kinds of exercises, because they will come with a different perspective. I was talking to somebody the other day who was mentioning how they use ChatGPT to kind of like enhance their writing, because like English is their second language, and usually it does a pretty good bad job of it. So they have to like go in and kind of like fix it, but it does the basics, like it fixes all like the basic like grammatical errors and things like that. And I don't know, if you don't automatically like have somebody on your team who kind of thinks in that way about how this tool can be used, you might not be able to like identify like those potential like opportunities or side effects or what have you. So, yeah, I mean, I do think it's like it's important. Again, like I can't stress enough like really putting together like multidisciplinary groups of people to do these kinds of exercises and analyses are core to systems thinking. And I think that oftentimes gets forgotten in systems thinking texts, like they get like kind of wrapped up in like the methods and tools, and then you forget like who you're supposed to be involving to do this. I think like one of the early kind of thinkers in the 60s and 70s systems thinking is Peter Cheklin, who wrote about hard systems methodology and soft systems methodology. And he really stresses that like you should be engaging with like a really broad set of stakeholders, because otherwise you're doing it wrong. um and I think that that holds true today. Like, it's not about you going off and creating causal loops. I think it's like you acting as using your design skills to act as a facilitator rather than just like, a producer of something. And that's where I think like my work has primarily shifted in integrating systems thinking.
Yeah, it's also thinking about some of the work you might already be doing through a different lens and what you can get out of it and how it can contribute to your work. I imagine a lot of folks listening have found themselves leading workshops, facilitating, doing a lot of internal stakeholder management, but the output of that might be, this broader systems view of the world that can improve your designs and your research. We could, I think, talk about systems thinking for a very, very long time. But any like parting thoughts for researchers, designers listening and really just kind of engaging with this topic maybe for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess I want to emphasize like you can basically start finding ways to integrate sort of systems thinking methods into your practice like right away, even if it just means like using some of like the simpler frameworks. I do think it's a mindset that is worth adopting, and that's kind of like the starting point is just like you start to kind of see what wasn't visible to you before and just like how things are interconnected, how things will play out. Like I was reading a article just this morning about there's like in the US there's this app that has just been released for asylum seekers at the border, and I was like, oh my god, they actually did there's an app for that for for this experience. And it's like, just not only is it a horrible like experience, the thing keeps crashing and whatever, but there's all sorts of systems problems with it. Like people don't have phones when they're seeking asylum. Like it's just, yeah, there's a million ways you can kind of imagine that this is not the silver bullet that they thought it would be.
Right.
And you start kind of seeing that in just like everyday situations. And I think, yeah, it really kind of shifts your mindset, not just about your work, but just how you think about circumstances in general.
Yeah, I love thinking of it as a mentality of just like, you can zoom out and broaden your perspective a little bit in without getting super sophisticated here, and that's a really good first step. I think we maybe forgot to mention it, but definitely check the show notes for a promo code on Closing the Loop if you want to check that book out. So it's a good read. I would encourage everyone to go grab it.
Yeah, we'll also link lots of the other, it mentions lots of great books and thinkers on this subject as well. We can link up with the show notes too.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, it's gonna be a busy show notes. Check it out.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been really educational and interesting and given me a lot to think about. So thank you.
For sure.
Thank you so much.
Hey there, it's me, Erin.
And me, JH.
We are the hosts of Awkward Silences, and today we would love to hear from you, our listeners.
So we're running a quick survey to find out what you like about the show, which episodes you like best, which subjects you'd like to hear more about, which stuff you're sick of, and more just about you, the fans that have kept us on the air for the past 4 years.
Filling out the survey is just going to take you a couple of minutes. And despite what we say about surveys almost always sucking, this one's going to be fantastic. So userinterviews.com/awkward survey. And thanks so much for doing that.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Awkward Silences, brought to you by User Interviews.
Theme music by Fragile Gang.